Welcome, everyone. I'm Don Schreiber, and this is Clearing the Air, a four-part conversation series on air pollution coming from oil and gas drilling and exploration here in New Mexico and the impacts that it has on all New Mexicans and our climate. We'll be gathering once a month now through September as we prepare for a very important rulemaking that's coming up by our state's Environment Department, which we will refer to as NMED. So you can find all of our episodes at cavu.org, clearing the air. That's cavu.org/clearing the air. On our second episode today, we're joined by State Representative Angelica Rubio and the Policy Director of the Center for Civic Policy, James Poviwa. Together, we'll discuss where New Mexico is now when it comes to addressing the climate crisis that we're all experiencing, what young people have to say, and what changes we need to make as a state to reach our critical climate goals. So let's meet our guests. New Mexico State Representative Angelica Rubio, it is an honor to have you join us today. I am a long admirer of your strong legislative voice. Also, I am a #1 Twitter follower of your great Twitter feed, and that is at @ANRubio. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm happy to be here. And same, I enjoy our little Twitter exchanges. So thank you for hosting and for inviting me.
So glad you're here. James Poviwa, Director of Policy for the Center for Civic Policy. Talk to us a little about yourself, and please tell us more about CCP.
Hi, Don. Hi, Angelica. It's great to be here with both of you today. Both of you have been incredibly huge advocates for all of the strong work that's going on in New Mexico up to this point. And as you were saying, I'm the Policy Director for the Center for Civic Policy. We convene one of the largest table of nonpartisan C3 advocacy organizations in the state. And one of the working groups in that coalition is the Power for New Mexico Coalition, which was formed back in 2018 out of the concern that communities of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, rural communities, Native people would be left behind in the energy transition. And so we continue to advocate with all of the allies out there. Representative Rubio has been one of our strongest champions. So again, really great to be here with both of you today.
Yeah, James, I cannot get past this point without a Clearing the Air shout out to our good friend, Gabe Paciniak from the UNM Law Center, who works so closely with CCP, and we made some real headway in the Oil and Gas Conservation Division over the double drilling issue a few years ago. CCP played a major role in that. So we're obviously so glad that you're here. I want to do this a couple of times today, and that's just set why we are here, give a general sense to our audience what we're dealing with, and just state some basic facts, some things we need to address and deal with. And that is that New Mexico is home to some of the worst methane pollution in the country. In fact, we are home to the worst methane polluting company in the nation. And as you may remember, they're still there. We're home to the methane hotspots. The first one in the San Juan Basin, that was called the Four Corners methane hotspot. It was discovered by NASA, who could see it from space. Now, unfortunately, we still have it, but there are bigger methane hotspots in the southern part of the state in the Permian Basin. So those are things that New Mexico doesn't want to be famous for, and we've got to, I think, as we are all recognizing, address that for our climate and the climate changes that we're facing. You know, methane, it's mistaken a little bit. They say natural gas. I say natural gas is the little bubbles in the frog pond, right? gas that comes, released, drills 7,000 feet under the ground, 5,000 feet in the ground, shoots to the surface with an explosive force. That's not natural gas. So when that gas, what I just say, it's gas, and it's something that is not natural. When it gets to the surface, bad things are going to happen. So that's our responsibility. When it comes up to the surface, it comes with a whole host of other chemicals, volatile organic compounds. Those combine to create ozone and smog, and they are very damaging to our health, to our future, to our state. Now, I don't want you to worry about, I'm talking to the audience here, our listeners and watchers on the webcast. I don't want you to worry about getting all these details down. We'll cover some today, but they'll be at methanemattersnm.org/take action. So we'll be posting that up to give you the information, to be educated, to get you interested and enthusiastic about taking part in the climate challenges that we have in New Mexico, make you confident in speaking out. So we're specifically creating this 4-part conversation series because the NMED has proposed a rule to regulate methane in New Mexico, and that rule is going to be judged in September by the Environmental Improvement Bureau. Then we would not even be having this discussion were it not for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's first early days action when she signed her Executive Order 003 on climate change and on assigning responsibility to the oil and gas industry for those climate impacts. That has never been done in New Mexico, and it is history making. So we are here when she charged her 2 secretaries, Cabinet Secretary Sarah Cottrell Props for Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources, and Cabinet Secretary Jim Kinney, in the Environment Department, to find solutions and for New Mexico to take action. So that's what we're talking about. We need to weigh in. We need to make our New Mexico voices heard if we are going to have what the governor has said she wants, and that is nation-leading rules. Colorado has revised their methane rules recently, just at the end of 2020, and they've set a pretty high bar. So we've got a ways to go to get there. I want us all to have that conversation about how are we going to achieve those nation-leading rules? How are we going to help our friends at the New Mexico Environment Department get their rules up to speed so we can do that? So today, we're going to listen to some stories. And I think the stories are so important because as we talk to each other and tell our stories, I don't think there's ever enough time for that. But when we do, we really start to make a connection with each other and the larger world around us all in one time. And that helps to bring us together to find solutions. And there are so many of us from different viewpoints that need to come together if we're going to find these solutions. A key to that, I think, is how are we serving the youth in New Mexico, our children, young children? What are we doing? How are we fulfilling our responsibility to them for the clean air and the clean water that they are entitled to? It's our job to do that for them. And as such, we're going to hear from 3 young New Mexicans today. Let's see what their vision, what they see for a natural world.
Hello, my name is Penelope. I'm in 6th grade at Aspen Community School. I see New Mexico in 20 years still struggling but doing better, especially if people like me and my school fight for climate change and the drought to get better. I also feel that New Mexico will be better in 20 years because I think it will rain more. We have already gotten so much rain that I can see the water in streams and rivers. I think I see New Mexico doing better in 20 years because I want it to be. But honestly, I think it will be better if we get more people to help stop climate change. Due to the pandemic, more people are moving here. That means more air pollution, more water use, more trash pollution, and more apartments. And more local people and businesses failing or moving. I'd also like to say that it's been much hotter here. A couple of years ago, it was never this hot for this long. I'd say it's a 50-50% chance. It's hard for me to say because I want it to be a 100% chance that it will be fine. But honestly, who knows? Thanks for hearing my perspective. Bye!
Imagine 20 years from now walking down the bosque, hearing the rushing river and the sweet sound of birds. It is a shady cottonwood forest where animals thrive and people come to play and walk. Imagine going to Albuquerque and seeing electric cars and buses whizzing by as a high-speed train takes passengers to Denver or LA. Many roads and tops of buildings are painted white to help bring down the temperature in the city. Downtown has been turned into a no-car zone, where there are outdoor restaurants and art studios where people can walk, run, bike, and socialize. You can see wind turbines spinning along the edges of the city and solar panels powering every building. Every neighborhood has its own community garden that has corn, zucchini, broccoli, kale, and strawberries. You can hear people chatting at a neighborhood garden where they can pick up their summer veggies and fruits. My friends and I trade seeds with each other, so we have a variety of plants that grow well in Albuquerque. Every week, I come home with bunches of fruits, vegetables, and eggs. When I look into my fridge, I don't see plastic. Instead, I see glass bottles and aluminum. When I walk into my living room, I see wooden, not plastic toys. When I walk into my garage, I see my electric car being recharged for the next adventure. I see composting and recycling bins lining every street. I see Albuquerque as a renewable city. When I turn on a light or take a bath, I have that good feeling of knowing I'm not using natural gas, instead using renewable solar energy to power my home. My home, my city, is a safe, fun place to live. The world dodged the worst of climate change because we work so hard to draw down emissions.
In 20 years from now, I envision a bright future for New Mexico's climate and economy. I can smell the fresh air, see the beautiful plants and greenery growing from our soil. I am hopeful that my children can grow up in a stable, healthy world that we can benefit from forever. A place where fresh, clean water is accessible to everyone. A world where there's more renewable and clean energy and less greenhouse gases are being emitted into our atmosphere. To make these dreams a reality for our future selves and future generations, we must come together and act now. The oil and gas industry produces vast amounts of toxic air and water pollution and is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. New Mexico is largely affected by the oil and gas industry and has seen the negative influence it has on our climate as well as our health. We need to acknowledge the negative effects methane waste has on our environment. We must also entertain the idea of switching over to renewable energy sources that can reduce CO2 emissions. I'm hopeful that New Mexicans can come together and save our precious land and animals, that we can put our materialistic wants aside and focus on the health of our planet along with ourselves. I'm confident that we can come up with solutions so that future generations can have the same opportunities that we have today.
Well, I think maybe we should turn them loose to run the state. What encouraging and hopeful young voices. And they're the reason we're here today. I want to stop for just a second, and on behalf of Clearing the Air and our entire CAVU crew, just to thank Penelope and Athena and Morgan for sharing your stories with us. Thank you so much. We are at an important moment in responding to this crisis for our planet. And it's important to keep in mind that young people, even infants, are affected disproportionately by the pollution from oil and gas, including ozone-forming toxins that we've talked about that worsen respiratory diseases and asthma. Ozone or smog can worsen emphysema. It can cause heart disease and even cancer. So Representative Rubio and James Poviwa of the Center for Civic Policy, from your perspective, is it important that these young people are speaking up and speaking out What's your response to these videos? Can we start with you, Representative Rubio?
Yeah, absolutely, Don. I mean, I wish more of them were in the legislature. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I feel like even, I believe it was Penelope at the very end, her imagination on what she wants she wants her city to look like, what her state to look like, is exactly how I envision my city here in Las Cruces and places around the state. And unfortunately, that's not the reality in many of our spaces in where we make public policy. And but I am excited about the potential and the possibilities moving forward. I feel, and James mentioned this earlier, is the Power for New Mexico Coalition has been very instrumental in pushing many of our policies to be not only more equitable, but also to be thinking bigger beyond just the issues that predominantly have uh, taken a lot of space in the legislature. I think that when we center frontline communities, especially rural and communities of color, Black and Indigenous, that we can reach these goals, the very imagination that Penelope has. We can reach those. We can reach that vision quicker when we center these communities, and I believe that's what groups like Power for New Mexico are doing, and legislators like myself are attempting to do.
James?
Absolutely, and I couldn't have said it better than Representative already has. So I will just add to that and thank the voices of our youth in the state. And I hope and I imagine that these young people will be our future leaders. And right now, for adults who are in positions of power, positions of advocacy, one of the best things that we can do is listen to our younger generation and to our directly impacted communities. And as Representative was mentioning, one of the missions of Power for New Mexico has been to elevate the voices of everyday New Mexicans throughout the state, especially those who are disproportionately impacted by climate change and the negative impacts of the oil and gas industry. And, you know, as you were saying, Don, our governor has had a bold vision for the state to ensure that we both have a very robust economy, but that we are also safeguarding our air, land, and water.
Yeah, I want to stay with what we just heard from these three young people for just a minute, because it really struck me, something that we don't talk about, gets crowded off the conversation, is I forget if it was Athena maybe that said, imagine. So we get into this, you know, a boilerplate, we get into our set positions, we get into our silos, we get into our fighting stance, we perpetuate a discussion that's been going on forever. It's kind of devoid of imagination. And when I see the kids and hear them speak and try to remember when we had our own imagination, we could imagine something other than just being locked in a struggle. So imagination could play a part in legislation. Could it not, Representative?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly believe that. I was appointed this past year to chair transportation and infrastructure. And for me, it's a really important committee, I believe, just as important as, say, our Senate Finance or Appropriations, because while this state has ultimately focused solely on roads, I think that my vision for the future of New Mexico is really how do we center our communities to be thinking about what infrastructure means to them. And I think we're having that national dialogue across the country, and that conversation must begin also here in New Mexico. We have our first interim committee in Gallup next month, which I'm really excited about, because I'm wanting folks to be thinking about that how can issues like infrastructure, transportation, and economic development, when it's centered in our frontline communities and the communities that we serve, is actually that actually helps us to address climate in a much bigger way and in a much faster way. And so these are the sort of ideas that I think, coming from these mechanisms that already exist in the legislature, could potentially bring to fruition a lot of what many of us would imagine our communities looking like in the future.
Imagination. James, as a community organizer, how important is that imagination in your work?
It's incredibly important. And I will just note the many organizations that are out there that do direct organizing in oil and gas country, especially Somos un Pueblo Unido, Café Acción, Café, and also the Native American Voter Alliance. All organizations that are, talking to people on the ground about what their vision, what their issues are, being on the front lines of climate change. And one of the things that we were able to do with the support of Representative Rubio was to get the funding and the mandate to do a study that was conducted by the Department of Workforce Solutions to examine what are the opportunities in renewable energy, what are the barriers. That study was conducted in 2020 during the height of the pandemic and the very bottom of the oil and gas industry tanking. And so that was something that was really exciting that happened last year. And it was really an opportunity to do what these young people just did, which was envision what does a New Mexico look like that is sustainable, healthy, and that is not overly dependent on the oil and gas industry. What was really exciting about that legislation, about that study, is that it led into legislation this past year that created the Sustainable Economy Task Force, which is a slew of very important cabinet secretaries and a group of advisory community members who are going to chart a path forward for New Mexico that is sustainable.
Yes, I'm excited to talk about that. And I've got a little space saved for talking about that, James. I want to be sure we do cover that, and a couple of other, or a list of other specific actions we might take. But before we leave the voices of these young people, to me, it's pretty evident that what they envision and what we are living today in New Mexico are two disparate things. Wouldn't you say? What's your own vision from your own perspective, Representative Angelica, and in your own work policy? How do those differences affect you? How do you see what's different? I can certainly talk about it from our ranch, where we just have an obvious example every day, because we live in a natural world that is full of both livestock and the natural world of wildlife and all the plants that are there. But there are 122 gas wells there, right where we are immediately. So I have work that I'm doing that is sponsored and assisted by the federal government to improve rangelands, to improve wildlife, and how they live in the world by, say, lowering our fences or replacing barbed wire with smooth wire, trying to develop water sources, not just for livestock, but also for animals, obviously so important in this crisis. But at the same time, I would have a giant truck or drilling rig charging down the road right through where we're working, trying to improve the natural world. At the same time, they're on their way to drill a new well. So those two things are stark for us every day on the ranch. Representative, do you see that in your work as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I didn't mention, which I think is the reason what brings me to this work in the first place, is the fact that I was born and raised in the southeastern part of the state. The majority of my family still resides in that area. All of them are either directly or indirectly employed by the oil and gas industry. And so what really brings me to this work is not only the importance of addressing climate and how we diversify our economy here in New Mexico outside of oil and gas, but I'm also thinking about the communities that these industries impact every single day. And when I drive home to Roswell, which is where I was born, or Lake Arthur, where I grew up, you see the surrounding areas just, I mean, it's what I've envisioned as what this planet might look like in 100 years if we don't do anything soon, in terms of the how desolate it looks, and what is happening in the southeastern part of the state, not only just environmentally and in terms of public health, but it is impacting the rest of the state as we try to figure out how we build an economy, how we work on paying our budget, like our dealing with our budget issues. And so I think so much of what we must do, and I think this is one of the areas in which I've talked a lot about in my legislative work, is that there's a lot of us with a lot of really great ideas, and that's great. But I think sometimes what happens more so than none is that we give directives to communities that are being impacted. We don't allow for them to actually be a part of creating this vision for New Mexico when we talk about economic diversification or talking about issues related to climate. What we do is we say, this is what we need to do, and we need to do it. And so I know that we're going to be talking about this shortly around the Sustainable Task Force, the Sustainable Economy Task Force, but this is really at the root of policies like that, and policies that we introduced this past session, is that as legislators like myself, yes, I feel like I have ideas and a vision and thoughts around how we get to addressing climate and all of these issues. But what I have learned as an organizer myself is that we have to be able to allow and empower communities who are being directly impacted to really lead the way, because ideas that they bring forward are probably much better than those of us that are currently in this legislative realm.
I saw James nodding his head there pretty strongly as we were talking about prescribed solutions. I was thinking of a book, an old book. It's a lot of my books are old, but this is Ripples in the Zambezi, where an Italian, if you know the book, an Italian Peace Corps worker and a group of them had gone to Africa with an idea of what they were going to do, and all their prescribed solutions ignored the local problems and culture, and it's a very informative book, and he kind of made it his life's work after that to avoid doing that. And in our situation, we started with Alan Savory of the Holistic Management Institute, who said, if you're not involving every stakeholder equally, you're not going to have a sustainable solution. So James Poviwa, we were talking about the methane rule, and I know you had a lot of engagement in the NMED rule and some of the big loopholes that were there, particularly around low production wells, also known as stripper wells or mom and pop wells. Can you talk a little about that?
For sure, Don. And here I really just want to, again, do a big shout out to Gabe Pasiniak at the University of New Mexico Law School and their Natural Resources and Environmental Law Clinic, who represented Center for Civic Policy and the Native American Voter Alliance EP. And, in this process, I'll stress that we and other organizations were particularly concerned about ensuring that people of color and low-income people living near oil and gas facilities would not suffer disparate impacts of the oil and gas pollution. As we've been talking about, And I think this is a real example of how our governor's administration is very responsive to advocates and the regular community. Those of you who are watching today, NMED took into account all of the advocacy efforts and concerns around stripper wells and revised their rule to ensure that those exemptions were not present. And it is a stronger rule because of that. And so I encourage folks to, as Don has also been encouraging, to get involved in this process because it really does have an effect.
Absolutely, James. That was a remarkable improvement in the rule, and it was the combination of diverse voices and organizations like yours, leadership like Gabe Pisciniak's, and others throughout the state that made that happen. And we have a much better rule because of citizen voices.
Absolutely.
And now might be a great time to talk about, the Sustainable Economy Task Force. Let's get it. Let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as a Native person, as a tribal member from Okeo-Wingate Pueblo, right, we know that that there is a tendency to have outside groups, outside individuals who are not from local communities try to establish solutions to local problems. And, that goes for all areas of the state. When we're talking about the Permian Basin or San Juan County and other areas, right, we need to hear from individuals who are living there, who are experiencing direct impacts from the industry and from the front lines of climate change. As I mentioned, right, we were able to get this study done by the Department of Workforce Solutions in close collaboration with community organizations, all through the help of Representative Rubio's strong advocacy in her position as a state legislator. And we heard directly from community members across the state. We reached over 1,800 New Mexicans who, in this document, explained what they believe are the barriers and opportunities for envisioning an economy that is not over-reliant on oil and gas. And I say over-reliant on oil and gas because where we are facing extreme challenges and crisis around climate change, and it is an imperative that we act, that we advocate for regulations that reduce things like volatile organic compounds. We also need to ensure that the communities that are reliant on the oil and gas industry and the current structure of our economy are brought along, that we don't simply flip a switch and leave what are more than likely Black, Indigenous people of color behind, because that is inequitable and that is not leading with the voices and the interests of directly impacted communities. So I'm very excited about the Sustainable Economy Task Force. I think it is a real opportunity for people of color to have a seat at the table in ensuring that we plan for an economy in which New Mexicans thrive across the board.
So Representative James was talking, about the Sustainable Economy Task Force. I know you're familiar with that. And we're speaking of specific things that can happen here in the state to sort of point us toward the imagined world that the young people were talking about, as opposed to the reality of what you in Roswell, where you grew up, me in Farmington, where I grew up in these oil fields, that reality that we see, that disparate reality. What are some concrete things we can do to move towards their world?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of opportunities. I know that for me personally, when it comes to just fundamentally people where they're sheltered, I mean, there's so many in our communities who are paying more in utilities, for example, because their shelter doesn't actually have the capability of being as efficient as other homes and rental spaces and things like that. And so fundamentally, I think those are really the priorities, is like, how do we actually address the livelihoods of communities all around the state through things that I think many in our community, many in the legislature tried to address this past session. There's the issues of environmental justice and environmental racism that very much exist in the state, that if we can get down to addressing those issues, especially in these rural communities, we can make significant strides. I think that from a public policy standpoint, and we touched on this earlier, is that in the past, for better or for worse, a lot of the work that has been done from an environmental standpoint has been very transactional. And so we have to be very clear about the types of relationships that we're building with communities, and making sure that that a lot of what we need to address, especially when it comes to environmental justice and addressing things like pollution and other issues related to public health, that that we don't allow a piece of public policy, even though it's good and addresses climate, also can potentially be bad for communities.
Yes, and James, you were speaking of that as well with regard to how do we bring along the people as we transition out of a fossil fuel economy? How can we be careful and not leave the people that are going to be most affected, job losses, or for us in San Juan County, I would say everybody works for the oil and gas business. If you've got the Dairy Queen, you are actually working for the oil and gas business. If you've got the auto dealership, if you have the real estate agency, so that it's not just the workers, they're immediately affected. And those so often are disadvantaged people who don't have all the options that the rest of us do. We've got to be so careful for them. We would like to be sure that we bring them along. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Absolutely. So I always say that our communities are experts in their own lives, and they are a wealth of knowledge. They can tell us what their vision for the future is, and what sort of an economy they envision that is sustainable. And you're right, Don. The oil and gas industry does, in many communities, support a broad economy, and that is the $1 million question, probably the $1 billion question. How do we transition away from oil and gas, from an economy that is destroying our climate and our water and our air, to one that is sustainable? And I wholeheartedly believe that the state of New Mexico, both through listening to our directly impacted communities and the expertise that we have right here in the state, that we'll get there. And the Sustainable Economy Task Force is the beginning of that conversation, just like our study with the Department of Workforce Solutions was a beginning of that conversation to, envision an economy that works for everybody.
I'm going to introduce something with regard to a sustainable economy going forward, people understanding their own world and how they live. There is not a switch to throw. That's not going to happen. If there was, I would still want the oil and gas industry to come clean up the mess that they have all over the San Juan Basin, 30,000 wells. The Permian Basin, if you shut it off, you still have tremendous pollution problems, abandoned wells, orphan wells, leaking facilities. Those jobs, those mitigation jobs, and I think that word's been a little overused, and we're a little bit lazy about saying mitigation, but remediation, restoration, and then the bringing the wells into a high standard. We should expect the highest standard. And when we do that, that generally puts, and see if you agree with me, Representative, that generally puts local contractors to work. When we're talking about plugging a well, when we're talking about doing the repair work, we're talking about doing reseeding and restoration, that's our local contractors. That's not the multinational Halliburton or ExxonMobil that does that. These are local peoples, our friends and neighbors, often the people that you're talking about, James. One of the things that's at the top of the page right now is the methane rule. There's actually 2 rules. And I'm interested in what your reaction, Representative, and also James from the Center for Civic Policy, what your thought or impression of the methane rules that are going forward now are.
Yeah, I mean, so to address briefly what you mentioned just now is that I think the way that we must address how we transition away from oil and gas and how we diversify our economy is that when we talk about it, people are under the impression that it's tomorrow. And what I have been trying really hard to do during my time in the legislature is to get people to understand that this is a multi-generational process. This isn't something that's going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next year. It has to happen amongst generations of New Mexicans. And in the way that oil and gas is operating at this moment, I think we need to just be very honest with communities and saying this industry is not going to exist in 2 generations. And if we can do similar to what the young people did in their video and help communities reimagine something else, these are the kind of jobs that they can be a part of. I think that is the fear that exists in a lot of these places, is that we talk about renewables, we talk about other industries, but for many, they're very proud of the work that they do in the oil and gas industry. And so how do we support them in being able to utilize the tools that they and the expertise that they have to actually develop and create a lot of the jobs that may not be specifically the kind of jobs in the oil fields that they have now, but that it can be an adaptation to so that their skills can actually transfer to something else. And for me, that I believe it's a multi-generational process, and that's how we should be thinking about it here in New Mexico. In terms of the methane rule, I mean, that is an issue that we have been talking about for years now. And I appreciate the leadership of the governor on making this as part of her, one of the first actions that she took for this executive order. I know that there's been improvements to the rule, and that is a decision that's going to be made specifically when it comes to air quality and air pollution. And there's all these other things that we could be doing in addition to the methane rule that I think also needs to be prioritized. And my hope is that while as this rule is making its way and hopefully finalized really, really soon and implemented, that we can gather once again to really come up with some real more comprehensive ideas on addressing pollution and the things that very much impact communities of color and rural areas around the state. They're the ones that are struggling right now, and those are the folks we need to be elevating.
James.
Absolutely. I completely agree with Representative. And, you know, she is very modest. She has been a champion of, in an innovative economy. Her work to establish an outdoor recreation department for the state is exactly what we need to be doing, is identifying other areas in our state where we can create a different type of economy. And, you know, I think it's really important to remember, Don, that, you know, we're leading the country in poverty. We're the 3rd poorest state in the country. And we are also one of the few majority minority states of the 50. And so I think it's a real fallacy to say that oil and gas has really brought us, tremendous riches. Unfortunately, it really is the biggest economic generator for our state right now. And that's the thing that we all want to tackle. And as Representative was saying, it's not going to happen overnight, but this industry is not going to be around in a couple generations. So we need to be smart. And ensure that we're planning for the future of our kids, of our communities, or for the long term.
Yeah, I think we appreciate saying that it's not just this or just that. Renewables will exclude fossil fuels, or workers put them out of work, or we have to drive ahead because we only have an oil and gas economy here and we don't have room for renewables. We can't get the tax base, or whatever the other opposition reasons are. Though none of that is true. The truth is both have to go forward in a generational way. We're growing renewables and we're reducing fossil fuels and going up. And by the way, James, not a better observation made. That's 90 years in New Mexico of the fortunes that have been created here, mainly by the major oil companies. And that money generally leaves the state by about 4 o'clock. I call it casino money, like it's wire transferred out to the bond traders in Boston or home office in Houston or Bartlesville, someplace. It doesn't stay here.
That's right, John.
Are they're hourly workers. They've never been unionized. That benefit has never come to the communities in any kind of relationship. We don't even pay as much royalty in New Mexico as they pay in Texas. Also, if we look at the property tax situation, you pay your full property tax. It's audited by your county assessor. Oil and gas pays a special rule, unauditable. They pay directly to tax and rev, and that money is, when they try to audit it, the counties have tried it. Reba tried it. Eddy County tried it, and the oil companies shut that down, or through their influence, that they're not contributing, paying their fair share. If they were, then 90 years into this, we wouldn't be last or second to last in so many social metrics. Yes, Representative.
And Don, one thing that I wanted to also mention, and the reason why I felt very compelled and passionate about what first started as the Climate Solutions Act, and then in the end was the Sustainable Economy Task Force, is that New Mexico, and this isn't just with oil and gas, but our leadership in this state has perpetuated this constant, we shoot straight to the very industries that exploit our communities. And so for me, I feel like it's important that through the Sustainable Task Force, the Sustainable Economy Task Force, is that we are being honest with ourselves, that we can no longer bet all of our money on these exploitative industries, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's the spaceport, there's all these issues that there are industries in this country, in this state, that we should minimize so much investment in when we're divesting so much from our communities to be able to amp them up. Meanwhile, so many generations of our people are just trying to get out of this generational poverty that exists in our communities.
I'm gonna take that and say this about the methane rule, because we did have some questions regarding the methane rule. Remember, there are two, and the one we're working on for September is the NMED rule, the environment rule. Just remember this, that regulation drives innovation, so that I have seen it time and time again. As strong regulations come forward, new innovations are made. We're not still grappling with things in the 50s that we have to do it the same way, that is too expensive, that industry says we can't solve the problem. We look at these young people that we had here today, Penelope, Athena, and Morgan, what is their imagination? What can they bring to us in terms of solutions? So let's wrap that up and say, look, the oil companies absolutely owe us their accountability to produce oil and gas at the highest absolute standard, and to bring to bring along the rest of the state, not just oil and gas executives, major stockholders. That money has to come down local, and we have to stop destroying our environment and the hopes and dreams of people like we saw today. So New Mexicans are already experiencing these severe climate impacts. We're harming our land, air, health, water, our future. You know, scientists all agree, NASA, the Department of Defense, that climate change is a threat to our future and to our kids' future. And we can no longer ignore this climate crisis and its catastrophic consequences. So I want to keep this front and center here. We have the worst methane pollution in the country. We have the #1 methane polluting oil company in the country. We are home still to the methane hotspots. We release volatile organic compounds that create smog and create health problems, including heart disease, asthma, and cancer for our health and affecting the health of our families and our future. So the Environmental Improvement Bureau Board, will hold a hearing in September on this NMED rule. And we want all of you watching or listening today to participate in that process. Use your imagination as the young people we saw today did. Talk about your stories, and let's get this rule improved further. We've got 3 things that we want to do as we improve this rule. We need to protect those living closest to oil and gas wells and development. And that often, James and Representative Rubio, are people of color. So that's one. Secondly, we need a timeline to stop pneumatics, phase them out. This is a big area of pollution. We'll cover the technical aspects of that in our next session. And third, we need to establish green completions, meaning not waste all of the methane that comes out or let it become a pollutant, a potent greenhouse gas after we drill the well, but before we hook it into the pipeline. That's the completion period. So let's tackle those things. We have those challenges in front of us if we're going to have a nation leading rule. And everyone out there, you can also weigh in on federal action that is addressing methane pollution by the EPA right now. Through the end of this month, through July 30th, EPA is accepting public comment on their draft rules, and you can access that at cutmethane.org. That's cutmethane.org. So I want you to join us next time on Clearing the Air as we make sense of climate change, air pollution, and energy development in Mexico. We'll be back noon on August 25th. And you can follow up and find all the information for reminders at cavu.org/clearing the air. We know that New Mexicans are impacted, so many of them, not just in your community, Representative, or in my old community of Farmington, but every New Mexican is affected by this. And we want to know what their thoughts are, all New Mexicans. Just as we heard from the young people today, do you have a climate vision you want to share as a viewer or listener? Do you have a story that you want to tell? Because we would like to help you get that out. You post your video to Instagram and Facebook and tag at CAVU.org, CAVU.org, and we will help you share your video on social media. So thank you again to our guests, Representative Angelica Rubio, James Poviwa from the Center for Civic Policy, and especially to Penelope and to Athena and to Morgan for sharing their stories with us today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don.